No way! They finally did it! The term build has a variety of meanings throughout various games, but it usually refers to a specific combination of abilities, skills, perks, gear, and other related mechanics that use in tandem with each other to create a gameplay loop that's greater than the sum of its parts. In Destiny 2, it's not very different from that. In this game, the main things you combine together for a build are your weapons, subclass, and armor. In reality, there's more to it than that, but pretty much every part of your build will fall into one of these three categories. Buildcrafting in Destiny 2 has always had a high barrier of entry due to the randomized nature of how you are to acquire a majority of the armor mods. But with the recent changes to the modding system allowing everyone to buildcraft, I figure it's probably a good time to go over how to make your own builds. Bungie announced a hefty rework to the buildcrafting system coming in Lightfall, so I'm mostly going to go over topics that will stay relevant post-launch. Even with the changes coming to the system being massive, they aren't fundamental enough to make the theory and process behind buildcrafting change that much. Pretty much the only thing the patch is going to do is change around the components that make up your builds. Here's the obligatory table of contents. If you don't care about the theory behind buildcrafting, or you already know how to use programs like DIM and D2 Armor Picker, then you can skip directly past those sections of the video. These chapters will be timestamped below, so it should be relatively easy to skip around. Before I go over how you put a build together, there's some third-party programs that you need to know about in order to get the most out of buildcrafting. As a side tangent, this is part of a larger issue Destiny has, where the game becomes nearly unplayable without some of these programs. That isn't an exaggeration, by the way. When it was announced that the API was shutting down for a week, the Destiny 2 community went wild because they didn't have access to DIM, and honestly, I don't blame them. I'll go more in depth on third-party programs another time, but for the sake of this video, I'll be primarily covering DIM and D2 Armor Picker. Although, as a quick rundown for anyone interested, other third-party things that can also be useful are the Destiny 2 companion app, LightGG, D2 Gunsmith, Today in Destiny's Eververse Calendar, and the Destiny Data Compendium, which also has links to even more auxiliary sources of information. All of these resources will be linked in the description below. First, let's talk about DIM, which stands for Destiny Item Manager. DIM is a third-party program that allows you to easily manage your inventory, move items between characters, and search for specific pieces of gear that you want. It's a must-have for any type of build crafter, as it allows you to quickly and easily switch between your different builds, saving you a ton of time and hassle. So there's a few ways to use DIM. To start, you can download the software directly from the website and install it on your computer. If you don't want to download the app, you can also just use it through a web browser. If you're a truly depraved Destiny player like I am, you can set it to be your default Steam browser, so every time you hit Shift-Tab, DIM is just right there. Once you start DIM, you'll have to connect it to your Destiny 2 account so it can access your vault. From there, you can move items between your characters and the vault, search for stuff, and even compare different items to see which one's best for your build. As I mentioned before, you can save your builds using DIM. To do this, go to the Loadouts tab, and you can just save whatever you're currently wearing. It even saves your transmog and shaders. If you want to make a loadout manually, select the items you want to use for your build, and drag and drop them into their respective slots. You can save as many loadouts as you want, so go and buildcraft to your heart's content. If you want, you can also import other people's builds, so you don't have to think for yourself. You can do a lot with DIM, but I'll go more in depth on those functions at a later time. If you want to manage your vault on your phone without using DIM, you can use apps like Ishtar, Little Light, and the official Destiny 2 app. With the official app, you can also pick up bounties from Orbit, which is super useful. Another third-party program that's worth mentioning is D2 Armor Picker. This program is specifically designed to help you choose the best combination of armor for your build. To start, go to d2armorpicker.com and hook it up with your Bungie account. After your account is linked, you can put in what armor stats you want, and it'll show you what combination of pieces you have to put on to achieve those stats. You can select what exotic you want to use, set energy limits on different armor pieces, and it even lets you account for different mods and fragments. If your Bungie account is also connected with DIM, you can save the results as a loadout or have it automatically equip items for you. Basically, once you know what your build is on paper, this allows you to actually put it into the game with just a few clicks. With how effective these tools are, it's no surprise that once you start using DIM and D2 Armor Picker regularly, you start to feel like they're mandatory. There should be an in-game loadout system coming in 2023, but I have a feeling it isn't going to be as good as DIMS, especially considering it's locked to 10 loadouts per character. Now that we have the pretense out of the way, I'm going to go over the general theory of build crafting. I think it's important to break down these core concepts so you get a better understanding of how you build before you start making one. After thinking about it for a long time, I've come to the conclusion that there's two main driving forces behind Destiny's build crafting. I call these two forces Expressive and Reactive. Expressive builds are all about using weapons and gear that you personally enjoy using, with minimal regard for the situation or activity that you're in. This type of build may not be the most effective, but it allows you to play the game how you want to play it. For example, let's say you're really into using Thorn. An expressive build in its most extreme form will center around Thorn, playing into its strengths and making up for its weaknesses. Then you'd slap on something like Necrotic Grips on top of it to really bring out its potential. Now, Thorn may not be the best choice for boss damage, but I sure do like seeing all those numbers. These builds are generally less effective in certain situations, but since it centers around what you like, you'll probably find it a lot more enjoyable to play these types of builds. One giant upside to expressive build crafting is that it allows you to explore and experiment with wildly different builds, which can be super exciting for those of us who enjoy nerding out over build crafting. Reactive builds, on the other hand, are all about creating the most effective build for a specific activity rather than using the weapons or gear that you personally enjoy. For example, if you're queuing up for a Crucible match, you'd build your character around what maps are in rotation, or what the current meta is, rather than using your favorite loadout. By build crafting a character that's custom tailored for the activity, you end up maximizing your chances of success. For the sake of this video, anytime I refer to the term meta, I'm referring to the most optimal builds and playstyles at any given moment. Like, for example, the PvP meta most of this season was just sitting in the back of the map with pulses and scouts due to the current map rotation having a large selection of long-range maps. This meant that shotguns and close-range playstyles could get picked off before they'd get in range. Of course, after a recent balance patch, this has shifted a bit, and it's bound to shift again come Lightfall since the meta is always changing. Since reactive builds are tailored to a specific activity, they can end up being less effective, or in some cases just straight up bad in other activities. If you're specifically using Void and Solar damage to counter match game shields in a Nightfall, that build's not going to be as strong in a different Nightfall that only has arc shields. Since you aren't accounting for the shields in the second strike, that build's going to be a lot less effective against it. Now, if you're a veteran build crafter, you may have noticed the dichotomy between expressive and reactive in-game, but under a different set of names. Expressive builds are usually referred to in the community as fun builds, while reactive builds are generally considered the meta builds. Basically, expressive doesn't care that much about the meta, but it does care about enjoyment and fun, while reactive doesn't necessarily care about fun, it just wants to complete the goal as well as it can. Every build in the game is going to be like a tug of war between reactive and expressive, or rather, what you like and what's good. All builds have some combination of both of these elements, so try and view expressive and reactive as a spectrum that a build can fall on, rather than two separate categories. Remember kids, the binary isn't real. So we have the theory behind builds, but what are they actually made of? Earlier, I mentioned the main categories of your build as weapons, armor, and your subclass. Weapons are, well, they're the weapons you use. Your subclass is denoted by the elemental symbol in the top left of your inventory. And your armor consists of the armor pieces that you're currently wearing on the right side of your inventory. I really hope that these are self-explanatory. Right now, the artifact is roped in with the armor mod system, but come Lightfall, it's going to be a separate set of passives that are added on top of your current build. The first major category I'm going to go over is weapons. Now, with Destiny 2 being a first-person shooter, you'd imagine that guns would be the most important part of the game, but as it turns out, that's not always the case. Now, I'm just some lady on the internet, so let's get an expert's opinion on the matter. Okay, but in all seriousness, the gunplay is the main reason a lot of people play Destiny 2. However, in the current sandbox, a lot of your damage comes from abilities instead. I'll comment more on abilities later in the video, but for now, we're just focusing on the principles behind choosing your weapons. Exotics are often the biggest part of your weapon loadout. You're limited to only having one at a time, which means exotics are usually a lot stronger than normal legendaries. Some exotics are really good in PvP, while others are more specialized towards PvE. Exotic primaries have a flat 40% damage boost towards all red bar enemies, making them pretty solid for ad clear in general. You should have an exotic on 90% of the time, since you aren't going to want to miss out on the synergies they can bring to your build. Most of them have very powerful and unique effects, making them a prime target as the focal point for your build. When balancing your weapon loadout, it's important to cover your ranges. Speccing purely into close range weapons can make you useless at long range, while only having long range weapons can leave you extremely vulnerable at close range. So if you have, say, something like Osteostriga on, you'd want to pair it with something like a sniper so you can actually hit targets at a distance. Now, that is assuming snipers will become usable in PvE one day. Of course, what ranges are best depend entirely on what environment you're playing in, which will vary from activity to activity. I like using a mid to close range setup in low-end content so I can shred through ads, while using longer range weapons for safety and high-end content. But what works for you will depend on your playstyle. In addition to ranges, you're also going to need to account for dealing with minors, majors, and bosses. This applies primarily in PvE, but with the new Iron Banner mode having Scorpio turrets in it, who knows if Bungie is going to put a DPS phase as a tiebreaker in some weird new upcoming game mode. Personally, I'm looking forward to it. In Destiny, there's 3 types of weapons: primary, special, and heavy. Usually a good rule of thumb is to use your primary for red bars, your special for majors, and your heavy for bosses. Of course, there's many different ways to break the mold, like running double primaries, double specials, or something like Touch of Malice to use primaries for DPS. Or even something like machine guns, which you'll use as a heavy for ad clear. Speaking of countering enemies, you're also going to want to make sure that the weapons you have a good selection of champ mods. But don't you worry, I'll talk about that champion system in a bit. Another factor to take into consideration are your weapons' damage types. Kinetic weapons currently have 5% more precision damage in PvE. In Lightfall, this is getting changed to 10% for primaries and 15% to specials. Similarly, elemental weapons get a 5% bonus damage to all shields in PvE, but it basically insta-pops whatever shields matches that element. If you break a shield with the matching element, you also get an explosion of that damage type around the target. However, Bungie did say they were changing this soon. Basically, in the future, all shields are going to have 50% damage resist against non-matching elemental types. But they're removing match game.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Weapon damage type also matters because it can synergize with your subclass. For example, only void weapons can gain volatile rounds, which essentially make your weapons explode enemies on hit. Similarly, only stasis weapons have access to the perk Headstone, which creates stasis crystals upon getting a precision kill. This brings me to my next point, weapon perks. Basically, weapons can be boiled down to the following factors: the starting weapon frame, the base stats, the 2 minor perks, the 2 major perks, the origin trait, the masterwork, and a mod of your choosing. You can't put mods on exotics, and instead of a masterwork they have exotic catalysts. The weapon frame and major perks are the 2 biggest contributing factors to how a weapon functions. Though it should be noted some origin traits are strong enough that they're essentially just a 3rd major perk. Rest in peace, Vice Stinger, you will be missed. Weapon perks can vary wildly in both effectiveness and complexity. Snapshot Sights is a super straightforward perk that lets you aim down sights faster. On the other hand, you have perks like Repulsor Brace. Now personally, I love Repulsor Brace, but a lot of people don't like it because of how hard it can be to activate. So basically, if you kill a Void debuff target, you get a Void Overshield. That Void Overshield can synergize with other parts of your build that affect Void buffs like Aspects, Fragments, and Exotics. Also, Void debuffs are a specific set of 3 keywords, not just any random debuff that you can find. Meaning, Repulsor Brace requires a lot of investment to get the most out of it. And all of that is just 1 weapon perk. Again, I love Repulsor Brace, but its complexity can end up making it niche. Personally, I love how specific you have to make your build in order to get it to proc. And when it does proc, I get to glow bright, purple. It literally doesn't increase my DPS at all, but man, glowing purple sure makes me feel good. I'd argue one of the most important things to consider above all else when it comes to making your loadout is weapon feel. Even if one weapon has slightly more damage output than another, if the weapon feels bad to you, then you're not going to have a good time. Ultimately, this is a video game, and Destiny 2 has enough variety in its weapon choices to let you find something that you enjoy while also being good enough to contend with some of the best DPS options. One of Destiny 2's strong suits is how satisfying its gunplay can be, so go out there and find a weapon setup that works for you. The second major category regarding builds is armor. Armor can be split into three main focal points: the exotic you're using, armor stats, and the armor mod system, which is getting reworked in Lightfall. Exotics and most legendary armor have 4 mod sockets. The first socket is for armor stats. Sockets 2 and 3 are based on the armor's slot, so either head, arms, chest, legs, or class item mods can go there. And currently the 4th slot is for combat style mods. Come Lightfall, these combat style mod sockets are going to be converted into a 3rd armor slot based socket. On top of that, the combat style system is getting reworked into a separate armor charge based system. Some pieces of legendary armor can roll with the 5th mod slot. Most of the time, these are activity specific, so something like receive less damage from Taken in the Last Wish raid, or deal more damage to nightmare enemies in nightmare hunts. There is one special case though, Artifice armor. The 5th socket from Artifice armor allows you to slot an additional artifact mod right now, but will soon be reworked into a mod socket that gives +3 to all stats. I'm unsure if there's going to be a specific mod that will cost energy that you'll have to slot in, or if it's free, but either way it seems pretty useful. Artifice armor only drops from master difficulty dungeons, but hopefully with this guide you should be on the right path towards making builds that steamroll that type of content. Exotic armor pieces are pretty much identical to legendary armor with a few caveats. Primarily, exotic armor has a unique effect when equipped, usually either modifying or adding components to the build. In addition to this, exotic armor has 4 slots available, but can't roll with the 5th slot like Artifice armor can. You can't transmog exotic armor the same way you can legendary gear. Each exotic has its own set of ornaments that you can only get through the Eververse store, or as random drops from Eververse engrams. I recommend using Today in Destiny's Eververse Calendar to see upcoming weeks if you want to plan out your Bright Dust budget. Other than that, there is one final difference between exotic and legendary armor. The highest base stat total a piece of legendary gear can get is 68, and the max base stat total an exotic can get is 71. I've heard some people claim exotics can get a base stat as high as 72, but in over 5,000 hours of playing this game, I haven't seen any evidence to back this up. Honestly, I think it's just a community legend. If you've gotten a 72 base stat roll exotic, please be sure to let me know. I won't believe you, but you can certainly try and convince me in the Elbone official Discord server. To dive into armor stats a bit further, I should break down how armor rolls work. So every piece of armor in the game can roll with different amounts of stat points. These stat points are split into 6 different stats, that being mobility, resilience, recovery, discipline, intellect, and strength. Mobility gives you move speed, jump height, and affects hunter dodge cooldown, but it does not give you sprint speed. Resilience gives you extra shield hit points, flinch resistance, damage resist in PvE, and it affects Titan Barricade's cooldown. Recovery affects how fast your health regenerates, how long the delay is before it starts to regen, and it affects your Warlock Rift's cooldown. Discipline, Intellect, and Strength affect your grenade, super, and melee regen respectively. I have much more in-depth guides on armor stats on my channel, so go check those out if you want a more in-depth look at how these stats function. I've already covered everything related to mobility, resilience, and recovery, but I wanted to wait until Strand came out to cover the ability-based stats. Currently the guides are a little outdated, but post Lightfall I was thinking of combining all 3 of them into one super video that covers all of the topics. Let me know in the comments if you guys want to see something like that. So the 6 stats are split into 2 different categories. The top half is for moment-to-moment gameplay and the bottom half is for ability regen. The one exception to this is your class ability regen, which is based off your class's primary stat. Again, that's mobility for hunters, resilience for titans, and recovery for warlocks. However, splitting these into two different categories isn't just helpful to us, it straight up affects how stats are distributed on armor rolls. When you get a piece of armor, the game will try and split the stat distribution in half, putting half of its points in the top half and the other half of the points in the bottom half. This is why it's nearly impossible to get triple hundreds in only the top or bottom half of stats, because the armor roll is literally made to break it up between these two halves. Here's a fun drinking game. Go rewatch that segment and drink every time I say half.
Julian!
I mentioned legendary armor can get a total base stat value of 68. This means every piece of 68 stat legendary gear is going to have 34 points in the top half and 34 points in the bottom half. If you have an odd number of total stat points, it has a 50-50 chance of putting it in the bottom or top half of stats. However, exotics can get a max of 71, so how do those 3 extra points factor in? Well, from my experience, it seems like those extra 3 points can only roll in the top half of stats. This means that the max stats an exotic can get should be 37 and 33. That's pretty much armor stats in a nutshell. The last thing to note is that right now, every stat in the game scales exponentially except for intellect. Intellect scales logarithmically, meaning that it has diminishing returns for some reason. This means that it is currently the worst stat in the game to spec into. Bungie commented that in Lightfall, many of the stat curves are apparently getting flattened out, but they unfortunately didn't comment on intellect. I mean, hey, at least there isn't as much super spam in the Crucible? The last section I was gonna cover over the armor category was combat style mods. However, they're getting reworked into an armor charge system instead. Unfortunately, we barely know anything about the armor charge system since it isn't out yet, so I'll make another video covering it when it does come out. But for now, let's move on to subclasses. As you know, there's 3 different classes in the game: Hunter, Warlock, and Titan. Each of the classes have multiple subclasses they can choose from, which affect what abilities and passives they have access to. Subclasses are split into supers, class abilities, jump abilities, grenades, melees, aspects, and fragments. Every subclass also has a unique set of keywords that they use. These are different buffs, debuffs, and mechanics that center around that subclass's element. For example, all solar subclasses have access to the buff Radiance, and all stasis subclasses have the ability to generate stasis crystals in some sort of way. In Lightfall, some of the keywords are also going to get anti-champion effects added to them, so look out for that in the future. Currently, there's 4 subclasses in the game, with a 5th on the way. Each subclass is based around different elemental damage types, so unfortunately there isn't a kinetic subclass. Yet. The 3 light subclasses are Solar, Arc, and Void, which are flavored orange, blue raspberry, and grape respectively. Right now, the only darkness subclass is Stasis, which is a bitter dark blueberry flavor, not to be confused with the bright blue raspberry flavoring of Arc. With Lightfall coming out, there's a second darkness subclass coming out called Strand, which I assume is going to be green apple flavored, but Bungie might pull a fast one on us and make it lime instead. Flavoring aside, I want to deconstruct how subclasses function. Supers, melees, and aspects are all unique to each subclass. Grenades and fragments, however, are shared between each element, similar to how keywords work. So Arc Titans, Hunters, and Warlocks all have access to the same selection of Arc Grenades and fragments. Speaking of class abilities, while every subclass has access to your 2 base class abilities, some subclasses have an additional selection of class abilities to choose from. An example of this would be Acrobat's Dodge for Solar Hunters. Finally, your jump ability will be the same across your class, but some subclasses will replace one of your jump abilities with a different movement option. The most notorious of these is Blink, the best jump in the game. Grenades, supers, melees, class abilities, and jumps are all active abilities you have, but aspects and fragments provide you with various benefits. These can range from augmenting your abilities to make them stronger, giving you a nice passive benefit that you don't have to think about that often, or just straight up replacing your grenade with a turret. You can only choose one of each active ability at a time, but you can have up to 2 aspects equipped. Each aspect gives you between 1 and 3 fragment slots. Generally speaking, the stronger an aspect is, the less fragment slots it will give you. although that's not always the case. In addition to passive benefits, the fragments you equip can also affect your armor stats, which means you're gonna have to balance your subclass and armor to make sure your stats are optimal. The fourth and final system for buildcrafting is the seasonal artifact. As you gain experience, you'll passively level up the artifact. Each artifact level allows you to unlock an additional mod from this artifact. Acquiring XP also allows the artifact to give you bonus power. Each mod goes away at the end of the season along with the artifact it came from. These mods range from providing anti-champion capabilities to your weapon, to just giving you bonus damage in PvE for being alone. There's a total of 25 artifact mods you can unlock right now, but with the changes in Lightfall you'll only be able to have 12 of them at a time. However, the biggest benefit of this is that they'll be passively active in your loadout instead of being mods that you have to slot in. Alright, I think I've covered most of the parts of buildcrafting that you can work with, but I feel like I'm missing something. Alright, so I'm gonna go a little off script for this next part. So back in Shadowkeep, Bungie added these funny little things to the game called champions. Now, champions are essentially mini-bosses that you'll find throughout, like, high-end PvE activities. Champions are the reason why a lot of your builds just won't work in high-end content. Champions are buggy as all hell and sometimes just don't stun. Champions killed my dog. Needless to say, I don't like champions. However, the biggest problem with champions is that they force you to run anti-champion stuff, because if you don't, you can't deal with them. And you can't get platinum rewards on a GM without taking out all the champions. Now, theoretically this system would be fine, but for the past couple years, there's no way to stun them outside of exotics that have anti-champion capabilities, or seasonal artifact mods that give weapons anti-champ stuff. I feel like one of the biggest problems with champions is how it feels like a giant pain in the ass just to deal with them. Like, you have to curtail your whole build. If only there was some sort of way to... Holy shit. They made it. They made the change. So Bungie announced that different subclass keywords are going to give you different anti-champ capabilities now. This solves so many goddamn issues with endgame PvE. Like, don't get me wrong, we still had to wait like 3 years for this. Like, this took way too long to come out, but like, you know what, I'll take it. It's fine, finally. Just to briefly go over how champions work, basically, they're little mini-bosses that are souped-up versions of normal enemies. So there's 3 different types of champions. There's Overloads, which can teleport around a bunch and have a ton of HP regen. There's Anti-Barrier, which will, after about a quarter of their health, pop a shield and regen. And then there's Unstoppable champions, which have 70% damage resistance when they're unstunned, but when they're stunned, you can damage them like normal. Unstops are the only one of the 3 that don't regen, so technically you don't even need anti-champion stuff without them. However, they'll walk up and one-shot you if you don't deal with them, so you might want some anti-champ stuff there. Something a lot of people don't know is that the recovery and stun time of champions actually varies based off the difficulty of the activity that you're running. So in higher end content, they only get stunned for like 5 seconds, 5.5, and then like low end stuff they get stunned for like 7 seconds. I don't know, it's really weird, it kind of feels inconsistent. So a little bit ago I mentioned that Bungie's making it so that way these new keywords are going to have different anti-champion capabilities. So the keywords with Overload are going to be Jolt from Arc, Slow from Stasis, and Suppression from Void. The keywords that have anti-barrier are Volatile when it comes from weapons, Radiant, and Strand will have something that's anti-barrier, but they haven't announced what it is yet. Shattering, Igniting, and Blinding will all stun Unstopped champions. Strand will also have a debuff for stunning Unstopped champions, but I'm not sure which one it is yet. Alright, that's enough of the champion rant. We can go back to the script now. Alright, so let's get to the main point of the video. How do I actually make a build? Well, for starters, you're going to want to choose something to focus on. Going back to that original Buildcrafting theory, we have 2 different starting points that we can work from. Those being Expressive and Reactive. For Expressive, do you want a cool poison build? Do you really like using sweet business? Maybe you can't unequip Argent Ordnance and are stuck in rocket launcher hell. On the other hand, you can use a reactive focus. Do you want to min-max so you can go flawless in trials? Maybe you want to solo a GM and have to account for all of the champions and shields. Again, every build is going to be a balancing act between using what's meta and what's fun for you, but by focusing on either one of these extremes as a starting point, it allows you to prioritize what you want later in the build crafting process. In other words, we're trying to figure out what the main focus of our build is. If you're an aspiring PvP gamer and you want to find out what the meta is so you have a fighting chance in trials, you can use Destiny Tracker's weapon usage statistics to see what everyone else is using. This isn't entirely accurate to what's actually good, since it's based off of popularity, but it does give you a good general starting point to work with. The two main ways you're going to get to know the meta for both PvE and PvP is through personal experience and other people. Personal experience is pretty self-explanatory, but in terms of other people, it can be your friends, LFGs, or even third-party websites. If you want to further your understanding of the game, I'd also highly recommend checking out sites like LightGG, the Destiny 2 Data Compendium, and D2 Gunsmith to get you started. I'll leave links to those resources in the description below as always. So now you should choose the main focus of your build, its main purpose. Remember, anything can be the focus of your build, whether it's a specific weapon you like, an activity you want to beat, or maybe it's a specific movement ability that has a cult dedicated to it. As long as you know the main reason you're making the build, you should be set. From here, we can finally start fleshing out the framework based on our focus. The buildcrafting process is a bit different between expressive and reactive types, but they're basically mirrors of each other. For expressive builds, you should focus on expanding the weapons, gear, or abilities that you're focusing on. Look out for different mods, perks, aspects, fragments, keywords, and abilities that can enhance the focus of your build. For example, let's say you're a warlock main and you really like the exotic Lumina, so you want to make a build around it. Lumina is a hand cannon with the special ability to heal and buff allies, so if we want to expand on that type of build, we can start exploring other options that synergize with healing allies. In this situation, you might want to look out for the exotic Boots of the Assembler, since it not only heals and empowers your teammates like Lumina, but it also has built-in synergies with the weapon. With Lumina and Boots of the Assembler equipped, we have both of our exotic slots filled, so now we're going to want to put on a subclass that can synergize with this build. A Solar Warlock setup with Ember of Benevolence and healing nades is perfect for this, as it allows you to spam your healing abilities more often on your allies. Next up, you're going to want to slap on Touch of Flame for stronger healing nades, and Well of Radiance to boost your team's damage output. At this point, your subclass should basically be good to go for now. The next two sections of the build we're going to want to round out are the armor stats and armor mods. Now for this particular build, since we're a warlock, we're going to want to go for 100 resilience, 100 recovery, and in this case 100 discipline, since a big part of our build is our healing nade. As I mentioned previously, the combat style portion of the modding system is getting replaced with the armor charge system in Lightfall, so I'm not going to be able to cover that here. In terms of the other mods, you might want to put on a siphon mod to generate orbs for your team, then put on something like Innervation, which gives you grenade energy when you pick up these orbs. It should be noted that picking up orbs is also the main way that you generate armor charge in the upcoming system, so stay tuned for that. As a side tip, in PvE I'd highly recommend having at least one damage resist mod on your chest piece at all times to increase your survivability. The final part we need to cover are the remaining weapon slots. Given that Lumina is a primary weapon, I'd recommend pairing it with a special. Since the build is focusing on supporting your allies, and we already have our exotic slot filled, a disorienting grenade launcher can provide a level of CC for the build. For our heavy, we're in desperate need of boss damage, so from here we can put on a rocket or a linear fusion rifle. Personally, unless I absolutely need the boss damage, I pretty much always have an Eager Edge sword equipped, given how insane the movement speed is. From here, you're going to go through this process. Playtest your build, see what can be improved, try and cram the improvement into the build. If it can't fit, cut out part of your build so that way it can fit, playtest the new version of the build, then you repeat the process. Of course, your build is still going to have to account for champions and shields, but with Lightfall's upcoming changes, anti-champion capability shouldn't be as big of a problem as it has been in the past. Since everyone's builds are going to be different, it's up to you from this point on to tinker with your build. If you feel like you're doing something wrong, that's okay. It's all part of the learning process. Just keep tinkering with that build until you've hit the point where you can't really iterate any further. You'll know you've gotten to this point when it feels like you can't really replace anything without making the build worse. At that point, your expressive focus build is pretty much done. So for reactive builds, your main focus should be countering something like an activity, loadout, or playstyle. For PvE, this means matching up your damage to the elemental singe, making sure you have anti-champion capabilities, and accounting for the different elemental shields. In PvP, reactive builds are mainly here to counter the enemy's loadout or the meta as a whole. So an example of this would be like running Vortex Nova Bomb in PvP to counter Titan Bubble spam, or equipping a longer range loadout so you can compete with pulse rifles or scouts on longer range maps. Basically, reactive builds are all about countering something to the best of your ability. Since reactive builds are so specific, every build is going to be different in each activity, meaning your build is going to be extremely effective in a specific situation, but probably isn't going to be the best in other activities. The easiest way I've found to make these types of builds is by making a list of what you need to complete the activity you're going for. So, for example, if you're going into a GM with Overload or Barrier champions in it, then you're going to want to bring something to stun those champs. Once you've gone through your loadout and filled out your list of requirements, you'll have the core of your build. From there, you're going to want to do the same thing you do with expressive build crafting. Playtest your build, see what can be improved, try and cram that improvement into your build. If it can't fit, cut out part of your build to put the improvement in, playtest the new version of the build, and then just keep repeating the process. One of the biggest parts of build crafting this way is knowledge. In order to have a solid reactive build, you're going to need a good understanding of both what you're trying to beat and what works best to counter it. So if we need to know the meta in order to effectively make a reactive build, how do we figure something like that out? Well, a good starting place for learning is by watching high-level players and seeing how they handle these activities. Content creators like Saltagrepo and Esoteric are great examples of people you can look towards when you're trying to figure out what to run in these high-end activities. As I mentioned before, you can also use Destiny Tracker to see what the general population is using to get a good idea of what has a high usage rate in both PvE and PvP. If something has a high usage rate, it's either very good, very fun, or something new. The links to everything and everyone mentioned will be in the description below like everything else. Other than copying what high-end players are doing, raw experience and playtime is also a giant factor to knowing the meta. But I figure something like that is already pretty self-explanatory, so here are some general principles I've noticed throughout my playtime. For weapons, generally the shorter the range, the higher the DPS it has. So for example, sidearms and SMGs have the most raw DPS of all primary weapons, but also have the shortest ranges. Scouts and pulses are the opposite, with high range and low DPS. This isn't always the case, but again, we're going over general tips. You know, broad strokes and all that. Rocket launchers are good for burst damage since they have a lot of DPS but low ammo capacity, while linear fusions have a high total damage due to their giant ammo capacity but lower DPS compared to something like rockets. Don't get me wrong, they still chunk bosses. I mean, they're linear fusion rifles, they're railguns. I mean, just look at a Cataclysmic with bait and switch melt this boss. I mean, it's crazy. Of course, the meta shifts all the time, so there have been times where, say, a linear can out-DPS rockets, making them the best in slot due to having high DPS and ammo capacity. For supers, in PvE, Well of Radiance is probably just the strongest super in the game right now. Bungie went out of their way to comment that they aren't nerfing Well of Radiance in Lightfall. Guess that means it's another year straight of being stuck to Solar Warlock. The main reason that Well of Radiance is slightly better than Titan Bubble is because you can actually shoot out of it. Generally, in PvE, one-off supers are better than roaming supers, since your neutral game is almost as strong as your roaming super anyways, so having a quick one-off effect is actually a more efficient use of your time. In Lightfall, they're buffing roaming supers a bit, but personally I'm not sure if this is going to be enough to make them better than one-off supers in PvE. For PvP, one of the biggest things to note is that weapon handling essentially is your TTK. Weapon handling and range are the two most important stats for most weapons in PvP. You're also going to have to play your ranges, so if you have a hand cannon and a shotgun, it wouldn't be very smart to run down a sniper lane. Targeting, handling, and unflinching mods are key for buffing up your weapons in PvP to get the biggest advantages that you can. Again, experience is going to be your main friend here, so try and learn from every death you have. Sure, a lot of the time it's going to be like, ah yes, I spawned into another super, not much I could do about that. But even if what you died to was complete bullshit, most of the other times you die, you can still learn from the experience in one way or another. Okay, so to summarize the entire buildcrafting process, you're going to want to pick something to focus on, add synergistic components, playtest it, see what can be improved, trim the unused or underutilized parts of the build, and then just keep repeating this refining process until you're satisfied with your build. Alright, if you're this far into the video, hopefully you have a good baseline of theory crafting to work off of. So now I'm going to go over an example build completely from start to finish. Earlier, I focused heavily on an expressive example with Lumina, so for this part I've chosen to show off a more in-depth look at how a reactive build would work. Okay, so looking back at the buildcrafting process, step 1 is to pick a focus. The GM for the last week of this season is Warden of Nothing, so let's make a build to counter that. Warden is a unique GM in the sense that it has all 3 champion types in it, meaning we're going to need all 3 different anti-champion capabilities. Post Lightfall, this is going to be way easier to achieve given that keywords will have those beautiful, beautiful anti-champion capabilities, but for now, we're going to have to rely pretty much exclusively on our weapons. The Singe for Warden of Nothing is solar, so we're going to want to play into that. Starfire Protocol is a very powerful solar-based exotic, and is currently one of the best builds in the game, not only in terms of damage output, but also because it has access to Well of Radiance for your team. So Starfire is a pretty easy choice, especially since it will literally allow me to melt through the strike. With Starfire, you're essentially locked to running Fusion Nades, Empowering Rift, and Touch of Flame. For me, Icarus Dash is also a must-have since the movement capabilities allow you to dodge out of the way of a lot of things. An example of this would be the trains. I'm also putting on Ember of Ashes to boost our Scorch output, allowing us to ignite enemies way easier. As a side note for Starfire Protocol, using Witherhoard's tick damage allows you to generate your grenades super fast, which is one of the main ways you can use the exotic to generate insane DPS. Witherhoard's damage over time doesn't stack though, since it's technically counted as a debuff. So the way you get around this with multiple Starfire Protocol Warlocks is by using something like Anarchy, so you can still get the tick damage but aren't fighting with other people to get your damage out. Alright, so let's make a list of what we need. Firstly, we need all 3 champ mods, and secondly, we're going to need something Void for the shields. In order to cover all of these bases, I've chosen to go with Anti-Barrier Pulse, an Unstoppable Grenade Launcher, which also has Void for the shields, and of course, Thunderlord for Overload. With this setup, we should be able to counter the strike pretty easily. So now I'm going to go to d2armorpicker.com and try and get my desired armor stats. For this case, I'm going to be going for triple 100s in Resilience, Recovery, and Discipline. First, let's select our exotic, which in this case is Starfire Protocol. Next, I'm going to scroll down and select the fragments I'm going to use. Finally, I'm going to go up here and block off the class item sockets so I have room for artifact mods like Weaken Clear and Lucent Finisher. Again, come Lightfall, artifacts will be a passive benefit, so in the future you'd only do this if you want to fit in normal mods. Now I'm going to click for 100s in the order that I need them. So first is 100 Resilience, then Recovery, and finally Discipline. Next, I'm going to sort by the highest number of tiers available. This means the total amount of armor stat tiers the build has in all of its categories combined. So the more tiers, the more total stats. Now the top result isn't always going to be the best one, but in this case it's really well rounded, so I'm going to equip this on my character. From here, I'm going to put on my stat mods to get triple 100s. Then I'm going to put on those artifact mods that I mentioned earlier. Gotta put on those anti-champ mods on the arms for the last time. Oh, and can't forget those resist mods. Also gonna put on this basic well setup, but by the time you're watching this, they aren't even gonna be real anymore. Actually, maybe they never even were real in the first place. I personally like to believe Warmind cells were just a collective fever dream and didn't actually exist.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
At this point, the build is essentially done, so let's boot up that Warden of Nothing strike and see how it goes. Alright, Overload Champion, already stunned. Easy peasy.
Oops, I used my melee so I can't stun the unstoppable.
Don't worry, we got it.
Got him.
Grenades. Just like that.
I'll make heavy on the next one.
A Cheese for Ever Guardian just did a thing where you can, so if you stand right here at the edge, it won't let it
fuck?
commence.
Okay. Nice one, Kresge. Keep damaging. Beautiful.
Alright. No, I can't. Never mind.
Void
All right,
shield
let me know when you're ready.
taken down. Blinded. Alright, let's DPS the boss. Good tether. Don't worry, we got this. Don't worry. Thunderlord. And it's just that easy.
A little sketchy.
Yeah. I got an example.
Well, that's a wrap on the build crafting guide. Remember, practice makes perfect, so keep experimenting with different builds and find out what works best for you. The most important part of builds is always having fun, whether that fun comes from using wacky niche builds or from steamrolling high-end content. Thanks for sticking around this long, and if you want to help out, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, or share the video if you found it helpful. My channel's pretty small, so sharing it with other people actually helps a lot more than you'd think. I also have other videos related to build crafting, so if you want more content like this, you can go ahead and check those out. There's a playlist for those guides in the description. About halfway through making this video, I got sick, so if you're wondering why my strange voice got even stranger, that's why. A huge thanks goes out to all those who helped me make this video. Their names are going to be on screen in alphabetical order. A super big thanks goes out to my good friends Jaybird and Battle, who really helped out a lot behind the scenes. Without their support, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. Well, that's all for now. Bottom text.